Yeah, dear ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anton. I'm a sociologist working at the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology and Mental Health, the IGPP, in Freiburg. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in Würzburg, but today is our second son's first day in school, and we will have a little party later. And of course, this is something I don't want to miss. So my presentation is about the topic exosociology, extraterrestrial intelligence, and the consequences of first contact. So let's start with a very fundamental question. Could intelligent extraterrestrial life exist? And if so, how frequently? Of course, you all know this. This is the famous Drake equation created in 1961 to estimate the number of intelligent alien species in our galaxy. At the beginning of the 1960s, we could not determine any of the factors in the equation with certainty. This is why Frank Drake spoke of a compounding of uncertainties. Today, we of course know much more about space than we did at the beginning of the 1960s and can therefore determine at least the first three of the factors with a high degree of certainty. However, the last factors are still a mystery to us, and therefore all attempts to determine the number of possible extraterrestrial civilizations remain speculation. Nevertheless, researchers are again and again trying to determine the factors as well as possible in order to get a number of possible extraterrestrial civilizations. And of course, my colleague Michael Schetscher and I did the same. What you can see here are different scenarios that we have calculated, ranging from conservative to optimistic. The moderate scenario is the one we consider most realistic. The result, there could be around 56, not 42, extraterrestrial civilizations in our galaxy. Other researchers here, for example, a team from the University of Nottingham, came up with similar numbers. These researchers assume that there are 36 civilizations in our Milky Way. So several dozen might therefore be a good number. But the truth is, we have no idea. There may be not a single extraterrestrial civilization in our Milky Way galaxy, but there could also be thousands of them. No one can clearly estimate the probability of the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations or of us making first contact with them one day. But there's a simple formula for calculating the risk of a potential future event. The risk is the probability of a potential event multiplied by the potential consequences of this event. While it is not possible to determine the probability of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization, what can be said is that the consequences of such an event could be dramatic. This fact alone, in our view, justifies engaging with this topic. A comparable example would be the impact of a meteorite. The probability may be low, but the consequences could be dramatic. Therefore, it makes absolutely sense to address this topic. And this brings us to exosociology. The first definition of exosociology was given by a Russian scientist named Kaplan in 1969. He basically summarized all attempts to find extraterrestrial intelligences under the term exosociology. Unfortunately, his approach was more or less forgotten. In 1983, the American sociologist Jan Meyer again defined an exosociology, probably without having known Kaplan's work. To this day, we have not been able to find a picture of Meyer. I took this wonderful picture of Hawaii because Meyer lived and worked in Hawaii. According to Meyer, exosociology should deal with the question of what sociology can tell us about potential extraterrestrial societies. But also Meyer's approach was more or less forgotten and generated almost none resonance in the scientific community. So, and since 2019, my colleague Michael Schetscher and I have been trying to establish exosociology again, and of course we hope that we will fare better than our colleagues Kaplan and Meyer. Here are some of the main arguments or assumptions of exosociology. Recent astrophysical findings make it seem increasingly likely that humanity will come into contact with an extraterrestrial civilization one day. There are no internationally recognized guidelines on how to deal with potential extraterrestrial civilizations. A first contact event could have serious consequences and greatly influence all the important systems of human societies, such as politics, economics, science, religion, and so on. These consequences could be so drastic because humanity is in no way prepared for a real contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. Okay, here are the main or key questions of exosociology according to the ideas of Michael Schetsche and myself. From a sociological perspective, how should the assumptions underlying today's SETI, SETA, and METI projects be assessed, and what contributions social sciences could make to the further development of such research programs in general? What characteristics must a being have, and how alien can it be for us to recognize it as an equal partner with whom we can communicate or interact or even grant it personal rights? Of course, this question is currently of great concern to us regarding artificial intelligence. Is it possible to make sufficiently well-founded assumptions about the social structures, motives, perceptions, use of resources, forms of communication, technology, stages of development, etc., of extraterrestrial civilizations? And what would be the consequences of humanity encountering an extraterrestrial civilization? As you can see, this is a complex field, and today we will only look at this question. What would be the consequences of humanity encountering an extraterrestrial civilization? My colleague Michael Schetsche and I have examined different scenarios of how first contact between humans and an extraterrestrial civilization could take place. We used methods from future studies, in particular scenario analysis. We differentiate between four main scenarios in our analysis. The Cygnus scenario, here we assume that one day radio telescopes will receive a radio signal from space that is clearly artificial. The IFEX scenario assumes that one day somewhere in our solar system or even on Earth, we will find material of an extraterrestrial civilization, such as a space probe or something like that. The encounter scenario, here we assume that an extraterrestrial spaceship appears close to Earth or even on Earth. Based on its flight characteristics and other actions, it can be assumed that the spacecraft is controlled by intelligence, whether biological or artificial. And in the UAP scenario, we assume that the increased public, scientific, and political attention that the UAP topic has received in recent years will lead to a situation where science, politics, and media confirm that at least a few UFO or UAP cases in past and present are indeed due to extraterrestrial technology. We examined all of these scenarios addressing questions such as which factors would influence human reactions in a first contact event. To give you just one example, we assumed that it would play a major role in the Cygnus scenario, the first scenario, how long the signal had traveled to Earth, given that we could find the origin of the signal. From our point of view, it would make a big psychological difference whether an extraterrestrial signal had been traveling for, let's say, 20 years or 1,000 years. Unfortunately, due to the short time available, I cannot go into further details of the different scenarios, but would like to go to an overview. This overview shows the different scenarios and their potential impact on different areas of society as identified in our analysis. I can't go into detail here, but one thing is obvious. The closer extraterrestrial entities come to us, the more dramatic the consequences could be. Therefore, spatial proximity appears to be a key factor regarding the possible consequences of first contact. And I want to emphasize that one of our main findings was that a first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization poses a significant risk to humanity. However, this risk is comes primarily from ourselves. People could quickly behave in a way that could cause problems during a first contact event. From hysteria and mass panic to military conflicts, anything is conceivable. And this is independent of the behavior of the extraterrestrial entities. In our scenario analysis, we have not assumed any evil motives or behavior. We simply assumed that we would become aware of them in some way. And this alone could lead to dramatic developments. So this brings us to the question of whether first contact may already have taken place. The answer is maybe. I assume that you are all familiar with the so-called wow signal. Discussions about it continue to this day, and no conventional explanation has yet been found. You are all surely familiar with the discussions surrounding Oumuamua. Personally, I now assume that it is highly likely to be a natural object, but this case, of course, helps us to imagine how the artifact scenario could play out. And yes, of course, the UFO or UAP topic. To clarify my position here, and maybe not everyone will like that, I don't see clear evidence that we are dealing with extraterrestrial technology here, but there's, from my point of view, strong evidence for cases of very strange anomalous phenomena. But there can be no doubt that science must investigate this topic without prejudice, and that is, of course, why we are here today. So, in the second part of my presentation, I would like to give you some insights into a study that Michael Bolander from Durham University, John Elliott from the University of St Andrews, UK, and I conducted. Last year, we carried out an international survey on the subject of extraterrestrial intelligence. What you will hear now will be published next year in the anthology Human Life After Contact with Extraterrestrial Civilizations. The idea of this project was to obtain empirical data for the questions we analyzed as part of our considerations on exosociology. The key question was, what would be the social impact of a real first contact with extraterrestrial civilization? The survey contains 96 items on the topic of extraterrestrial intelligence and first contact. We used 4 language versions, English, German, Spanish, and French, and also sent out invitations to participate in Arabic and Chinese. The survey was available on the Durham University website from July to October 2024. And we had a total of 6,515 respondents from 88 different countries. So I think this is an interesting data set that we have here. At this point, I have to underline an important limitation. This is not a representative study. It's really hard to get representative data, a representative sample, especially in an international study. Therefore, our sample definitely differs from the general population, and the results cannot be generalized. It can be assumed that many of the respondents are quite open to the topic, as they would otherwise probably not have taken part in the survey. So one very positive aspect of our study is that we received a lot of international media attention and support. You can see here a few examples on this slide. At the top right, you can see a screenshot of an article from the German newspaper Bild-Zeitung. All Germans will know that. It's a very famous newspaper in Germany. This article alone brought us a lot of attention in Germany. So here are a few figures about the participants. We have a significant surplus of male respondents. Around 75% of respondents are men. Of course, we would have liked to see a more even distribution. However, this ratio is in line with other studies on the subject. For some reason, men seem to participate in surveys of this kind more often than women. The average is 47. The sample has an above average level of education. As you can see, 43% have a university degree. Around half of the respondents do not consider themselves religious or spiritual. As you can see on the slide on the right, the distribution between the different language versions is unfortunately very uneven. The German version has by far the largest number of respondents, while the Spanish version unfortunately lags far behind. One reason for this is certainly the different intensity of media coverage in the different languages of the survey. Okay, let's move to the results. Here you can see the answers to the question, do you believe humanity will ever make contact with an extraterrestrial civilization or that extraterrestrials have already visited Earth? As you can see, a very clear majority believe that humanity will one day make contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. In the lower diagram, you can see the combined results for strongly agree and agree. 77% believe that first contact will happen one day. And the second result is even more interesting. 60% believe that Earth had already been visited by extraterrestrials. I find that a very remarkable figure. These figures alone show us that we are dealing with a sample in which there is a great openness towards this topic, of course. So on this slide, you can see the responses to the question, do you agree that humans should be sending messages into space with the aim of contacting extraterrestrial civilizations, even if the messages disclose Earth's location? As you can see, a clear majority is in favor of sending messages to potential extraterrestrials and is therefore rather positive about potential contact. It is interesting, however, that there are also some who do not think sending messages is a good idea. This means that there's a certain ambivalence here, and we will see more of this ambivalence in the data later. There are also interesting results. The question here is who should decide whether we send messages to extraterrestrials or respond to an extraterrestrial signal. In both cases, respondents favor scientific associations and global referendums. Interestingly, very few people would trust national governments to make the right decisions on this issue. People clearly have little confidence in politicians' ability to make the right decisions in this context. Scientific associations, on the other hand, enjoy a high level of trust. The slide shows the answers to the question of how respondents would react if we receive an extraterrestrial signal. A clear majority would react with excitement. However, around a third would be concerned. This again shows a certain ambivalence. By the way, if you are wondering why the total here and in other tables is over 100%, this is because the answers were not exclusive and each item had to be answered separately. Some respondents therefore agreed with both statements. I would be excited and I would be worried. So this again points to some ambivalence here. We got very similar responses to the question of how respondents would react if we discovered an extraterrestrial object on the moon. The diagram on the right compares these two scenarios. Interestingly, respondents would be less concerned about an object discovered on the moon than about an extraterrestrial signal. We also asked about specific possible reactions, for instance, to an alien spaceship entering Earth orbit. It turns out that most people would not change their behavior at first and just would wait and see. However, it is interesting to note that almost half of the respondents would get a stockpile of food, around a fifth would go to a safe place, and also around a fifth would get as much cash as possible from the bank, and around 12% would stay at home as a precaution and not go to work. I think this is very interesting. A high percentage of respondents believe that they have seen a UFO. It should be noted, of course, that we have not specified here what exactly a UFO is or what we mean by the term. Around 35% is a very high figure, which one again highlights the fact that we are dealing with a very specific sample here. But at this point, it is very interesting to compare this with a really representative study my colleagues and I at the IGPP conducted in Germany last year. As you can see here, right, we explicitly asked about extraterrestrial spacecraft, and around 14% of respondents said they believed they had seen something like this before. This is also a very high figure, and when you consider the difference of the questions, it becomes clear that the sample in our international survey is not so far removed from representative samples, at least for some questions. Finally, I would like to show you some more deeper analysis of possible statistical correlations. What you can see here are the answers to the question of whether we will one day make first contact with extraterrestrials or whether they have already visited Earth, differentiated by gender. As you can see, there are no statistically significant differences. And this also applies to other questions. This means the gender factor does not seem to play an important role here in general. The situation is slightly different when it comes to educational levels. People with higher levels of education seem to be somewhat more skeptical overall about the question of first contact or visits by extraterrestrials in the past. The differences are not huge, but they are clearly statistically significant. Spirituality and religion also seem to play a role. As can be seen here, spiritual or religious people are on average more likely to believe that contact with an extraterrestrial civilization will one day happen. The differences are very clear when it comes to the question of whether Earth has already been visited by extraterrestrials. Around 72% of respondents who consider themselves religious or spiritual believe this to be possible, but only 51% of respondents who say they are not spiritual or religious. So, this is the most interesting slide for me. It shows the respondents' assessments of how strong the social influences of various scenarios would be. The scenarios range from finding simple microbes on an exoplanet to direct contact with an extraterrestrial technology or even extraterrestrial biological beings. Here we see the combined results for existential and severe. It becomes very clear here that two factors play a key role. Firstly, the spatial proximity, and secondly, the biological nature complexity of the extraterrestrials. This demonstrates something that is also known from psychological research. We perceive a potential threat as more dangerous when it comes close to us. Conversely, distance creates a feeling of security. Interestingly, this is very much in line with the results of the scenario analysis that Michael Schetsche and I carried out, which I mentioned at the beginning. It can therefore be said that we came to pretty similar results using two different methods. Okay, here's a quick summary of our results. As I mentioned several times, our sample is not representative. Nevertheless, the dataset provides interesting insights into the opinions and perceptions of the populations of different countries on the topics of extraterrestrial intelligence and first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. What we see again and again in the data is a certain ambivalence. Curiosity, joyful interest, and even hope on the one hand, fear and concern on the other. This refers to a fact that we know from science fiction. Extraterrestrials are a projection surface for fears, hopes, fantasies of redemption, ultimately for everything human. In the end, extraterrestrials are a mirror of ourselves. Perceptions of extraterrestrial intelligence appear to depend very little on factors such as country of origin or gender. The factors spirituality, religion, and level of education, on the other hand, do appear to have an influence. Religious or spirituous people are somewhat more open to the topic, while people with a high level of education are somewhat more skeptical when it comes to the question of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. The expected consequences of first contact are all the more dramatic the closer the extraterrestrials come to us. Furthermore, the expected consequences obviously depend on whether we are dealing with extraterrestrial technology or even extraterrestrial biological beings. There are a lot more interesting results in the data. We will carry out further detailed analysis in the coming weeks. Today, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of initial impressions of the data. So, okay, this is my last slide. I'm coming to my conclusion. An encounter with an extraterrestrial civilization may seem unlikely, but if it happens, the consequences are likely to be dramatic. Of course, it's possible that first contact will never happen. However, it could also happen tomorrow. Of course, first contact could have positive effects for humanity, but our analysis have shown that it also poses enormous risks. The risks of first contact are primarily posed by humanity itself. The hope that humanity could overcome its conflicts through confrontation with an extraterrestrial civilization could prove to be naive. Existing conflicts could even be intensified. It seems increasingly advisable to take a scientific approach to the possibility of first contact with an extraterrestrial civilization. In the best case scenario, this could reduce the potential negative consequences of a first contact. And of course, exosociology could play an important role here. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Andreas, this is Robert. Thank you for your interesting talk.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm very happy that you finally included the UAP scenario into your first contact scenarios. I have a question, which I'm not sure you can tell me this as a sociologist, but while you were talking about the the lack of representative data, because all the people are biased, obviously, because they seem to have a strong interest in the subject, right? I was wondering, have you ever thought about how to overcome the general lack of interest in the public in the subject? I mean, that is, after all, a big impediment to ever get a representative study undertaken, right? If the majority of the people are just not interested in the subject, have you ever thought about that? How to overcome the general lack of interest in the public?
Okay. I think these are two different questions. The first question is, the problem is, as I told, we have a very specific sample here. Maybe I should also mention that the survey is pretty long, 96 questions. So you have to be motivated to do this, and this is like a selection. So I think we have a sample of respondents here that is very interested in this topic. So otherwise they wouldn't do this. And the second question is, how could we, if I get you right, how could we what could we do to so that more people are interested in these topics? Is this the question, Robert?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of interest in these topics from my point of view. As I mentioned, the exosociology as an approach, they tried to establish it at the end of the 60s and then later, and there was no resonance. And Michael Schetsche and I, with our approach, we have a lot of resonance. A lot of people are interested in this, not only in the scientific community, only in the media. So I think the situation now is much better than it was some years ago, and this is from my point of view also because of the whole discussion about exoplanets and the Oumuamua discussion, Avi and all these topics, and of course the UAP topic in the United States. This all is like inspiring the ideas of people regarding this topic, space and life and intelligent life. So I think there is a lot of interest in these topics.
Okay. Can you hear me, Andreas?
Hmm?
Christian here. Grüß dich.
Yeah.
So I'm asking the opposite to Robert, because my interest would be, I find it particularly, I wouldn't say it's sad, but it's less informative, the fact that this is so self-selected through the process. And I know from my work in empirical social sciences, I'm talking about the survey, you explained that, and it's evident, and that's okay, but I would rather look at a society that is, indifferent to the topic, and then look what the distributions of positions are to get some sort of a representative image. Now, have you tried to control through propensity scores and stuff like that to get your sample, to debias your sample? And the second quick question is, as a political scientist, and it's really perfect. Our two presentation will resonate a lot today. As a political scientist, have you introduced in your demographics or in the introductory session? I remember reading the survey, but I don't remember the fact. Are there political items, you know, self-orientation and conservative, progressive, and blah, blah, blah?
Okay. Second question first. No, we have no political items, but this, yeah, maybe this could be interesting. And the first question to the sample. I mean, as I mentioned, we did last year a representative study at the IGPP regarding paranormal experiences. It is very difficult and also very expensive to do a representative study because you need a real representative sample, and you have to make sure that all groups in society are represented in this sample, and this is very difficult. And our idea was to have an international sample to compare different countries, and so it would be so expensive to do this, and we had almost none budget. So we would like to do a representative study, but we just don't have the resources to do that.
Okay, thank you. I would like to continue with the next presentation, but just a very quick comment to that. That calls for funded projects. That's what we are doing in IFEX. We are preparing proposals for funded projects, and I think this would be one of them.